Power rarely collapses in public. Most empires rot quietly, behind closed doors, protected by fear and money. But sometimes, power makes a mistake so small it looks harmless, a sentence spoken too casually, a look held for 1 second too long, an insult delivered without thinking about who is listening. For Dutch Schultz, that mistake did not come from weakness. It came from certainty, the belief that no one in New York was allowed to correct him. In the early 1930s, Schultz did not just control numbers, rackets, and bootlegging routes. He controlled the air around him. Men changed the way they stood when he entered a room. Business owners lowered their voices. Rivals measured their words carefully, because a single wrong tone could cost a life. Schultz had built his reputation on rage. Unpredictable, loud, violent rage. That reputation protected him better than any bodyguard ever could. But reputation can turn into a blindfold. On the surface, the insult seemed minor. No weapon was drawn, no blood spilled, no immediate retaliation. It happened in a room filled with people who pretended not to notice. Men who had survived long enough in New York to know when silence was safer than honesty. Schultz believed the moment passed. He believed the balance remained in his favor. What he failed to understand was that insults in the underworld are never about words. They are about hierarchy. And hierarchy, once questioned, must be answered. The man on the receiving end of that insult did not react the way Schultz expected. There was no shouting, no sudden violence, no attempt to prove toughness. Instead, there was stillness, a controlled stillness that only appears when someone decides to remember everything. Schultz mistook that silence for fear. That was his fatal miscalculation. Because fear fades, memory does not. The insult traveled faster than Schultz realized. It moved quietly through back rooms, barber shops, private apartments, and gambling floors. It changed shape as it spread, becoming sharper with every retelling. What mattered was not the exact wording. What mattered was the meaning behind it. Schultz had publicly reduced another powerful figure, and by doing so, he had sent a message to everyone watching: power could be taken without consequence. In the criminal world, that message is poison. Men who had tolerated Schultz began to reassess him. Allies wondered whether staying loyal now carried more risk than benefit. Rivals, once cautious, started to imagine alternatives. Not rebellion yet. Just possibilities. Just questions. And questions are where wars begin. Schultz, meanwhile, felt untouchable. His past had trained him to believe that violence solved everything. If someone became a problem, they disappeared. If rumors spread, money smothered them. If fear weakened, blood restored it. This formula had never failed him before. So he kept moving forward, louder than ever, harsher than ever, convinced that dominance only needed to be displayed more aggressively. What he did not see was the shift beneath his feet. The city had changed. The mafia had changed. Power was becoming quieter, more organized, more strategic. Emotional explosions were no longer impressive. They were liabilities. Schultz's rage, once his greatest weapon, now marked him as unstable, dangerous not just to enemies, but to anyone near him. The insult had done something irreversible. It separated Schultz from the future. While he relied on fear, others relied on patience. While he threatened, others calculated. Meetings took place without him. Decisions were made in rooms he no longer entered. Lines were drawn that did not include his name. He remained powerful, but power without trust is temporary. And in New York, temporary power attracts permanent solutions. Schultz sensed tension but misunderstood it. He believed the city was challenging him openly, when in reality, it was stepping back and watching, waiting, letting him speak, letting him act, letting him expose himself. Every angry outburst confirmed what others already suspected: that he could not be controlled, that he would not adapt, that he would eventually force their hand. And all of it traced back to that one insult. Not because it was cruel, not because it was loud, but because it revealed who Schultz really was at the worst possible moment. A man who believed humiliation was harmless as long as it flowed outward. A man who forgot that respect, once violated, demands repayment with interest. By the time Schultz realized something was wrong, it was no longer about pride. It was about survival. The city he once ruled was quietly deciding whether he still belonged in it at all. And the answer was forming in silence. What Schultz could not yet see was that the insult had already done its work. It had turned allies into observers, observers into planners, and planners into executioners. The war had not started with gunfire. It had started with a sentence that could never be taken back. And the consequences of that sentence were about to come for him from every direction at once. After the insult, nothing happened. And that was the most dangerous part. No threats arrived. No messengers appeared at Schultz's door. No public challenge rose to meet his authority. New York did not explode. It exhaled. The city did what it always did when violence was inevitable. It went quiet. To Schultz, that quiet felt like confirmation. No reaction meant submission. No resistance meant acceptance. He mistook restraint for surrender. Silence, however, was not peace. It was preparation. Men who once answered Schultz immediately began delaying. Meetings were rescheduled. Information arrived late, thinner than before, stripped of useful detail. Familiar faces stopped showing up in familiar places. The social gravity that had always bent toward him slowly loosened. Power does not vanish overnight. It erodes, grain by grain, until the ground gives way without warning. Schultz responded the only way he knew how. He pushed harder. He demanded faster results, harsher discipline, louder obedience. He punished hesitation. He humiliated subordinates who failed to meet expectations that kept changing. Fear returned, but it was a brittle fear now. Sharp-edged, resentful, the kind that waits for permission to turn. Schultz believed fear still worked because men still nodded, still complied, still lowered their eyes. What he could not read was the calculation behind those gestures. They were no longer afraid of him alone. They were afraid of being caught on the wrong side when the balance finally broke. Elsewhere in the city, conversations unfolded without raised voices. Power brokers, who once avoided each other, now shared quiet rooms. Old grudges were acknowledged, not resolved, but set aside. The question was no longer whether Schultz was dangerous. Everyone agreed on that. The question was whether he was controllable. And the answer, slowly but decisively, became no. Control mattered more than strength. A man who could not be predicted could not be trusted. A man who could not be trusted became a liability. In a city where money flowed through invisible channels, liability demanded correction. Not revenge, correction. Schultz sensed the shift but misread its meaning. He believed rivals were afraid to move against him openly. He mistook coordination for cowardice. The truth was simpler and colder. No one wanted a war. They wanted an ending. As weeks passed, the silence thickened. Streets that once buzzed with rumors fell still. The absence of noise began to speak louder than threats ever could. Schultz's allies felt it first. They started hedging. Small acts of distance, neutral stances, exit plans whispered late at night. Loyalty did not break all at once. It thinned like ice before collapse. Schultz remained loud. He boasted. He raged. He reminded everyone who he was and what he had done. Every reminder, meant to intimidate, instead reinforced the same conclusion. He was stuck in an older version of power, a version that no longer matched the city. Violence was still respected, but it was no longer admired. Efficiency had replaced spectacle. Strategy had replaced tantrums. The insult, long past, continued to echo. It was remembered not as a moment of dominance, but as proof of recklessness. Proof that Schultz could not see the line he had crossed because he no longer believed lines applied to him. That belief isolated him more effectively than any enemy ever could. Meanwhile, decisions hardened. The silence began to organize itself. Pathways closed. Options narrowed. People who once depended on Schultz began to imagine life without him. Not freedom, stability, predictability, survival. Schultz noticed money moving differently. Protection that once felt automatic now required reminders. His orders were still followed, but without enthusiasm, without urgency, without belief. Power without belief is already dying. Schultz fought the symptoms instead of the cause. He punished delays instead of asking why they existed. He threatened betrayal instead of understanding. It had already begun. And still, no one confronted him directly. That was the final illusion. Schultz believed a challenge would announce itself. He believed enemies would roar before they struck. He did not understand that the most dangerous decisions are made without emotion, without noise, without warning. By the time confrontation arrives, the outcome has already been decided elsewhere. The silence had finished its work. What Schultz did not know was that his name was now being discussed in terms of risk management, not as a rival, not as a boss, as a problem. And problems in New York were not argued with. They were removed carefully, cleanly, and completely. The city was no longer reacting to Schultz. It was planning around him, and as the quiet stretched on, something irreversible took shape. The insult that began as arrogance had matured into isolation. Isolation was turning into inevitability. Schultz stood at the center of his empire, still shouting commands, unaware that the walls around him were no longer listening. The silence was not waiting for him to speak again. It was waiting for him to fall. By the time Schultz sensed real danger, it was already too late to stop it. The shift had passed the point where force could fix it. What once would have been crushed with intimidation had evolved into something quieter and far more lethal. His allies were still around, but they were no longer standing with him. They were standing near him, close enough to watch, far enough to survive. That difference mattered. In Schultz's world, loyalty had always been enforced, not earned. Men followed him because defiance carried consequences. But fear-based loyalty has an expiration date. Once people begin imagining a future without you, they stop protecting you in the present. Schultz failed to notice when conversations changed tone, when advice softened, when warnings disappeared entirely. Silence, again, was doing its work. Those closest to him saw the storm coming before he did. They watched the city realign itself, quietly and efficiently. Meetings happened without Schultz's knowledge. Decisions were finalized before he ever heard rumors of them. His name still carried weight, but it was now used cautiously, like a dangerous substance best handled with gloves. No one wanted to be seen defending him too strongly. No one wanted to be remembered standing beside him when the reckoning arrived. Schultz interpreted this distance as betrayal, and in one sense, he was right. But it was not personal betrayal. It was survival instinct. In New York, survival always outranked loyalty. The insult that started everything had done something irreversible. It had forced people to choose sides long before sides were publicly declared. Those choices were not announced. They were adjusted quietly. A delayed phone call. A meeting declined. A warning not passed along. Each small omission weakened Schultz's position more than any open attack ever could. He reacted by tightening control. Schultz demanded assurances. He questioned men who had served him for years. He pushed for displays of loyalty, not realizing that forced displays only highlight how fragile loyalty has become. The harder he squeezed, the more obvious it was that something was wrong. And the more obvious it became, the less anyone wanted to be the last man standing with him. Fear began to shift direction. Men were no longer afraid of Schultz's anger. They were afraid of being associated with it. They feared his unpredictability would pull them into a conflict they did not choose. His violence, once a shield, had become a spotlight. And no one wanted to be illuminated when the city decided to act. Outside Schultz's circle, the decision hardened. Power brokers who despised each other found common ground in one conclusion. Schultz could not be allowed to keep operating unchecked, not because he was cruel. Cruelty was common, but because he was unstable. He spoke without restraint. He insulted without calculation. He escalated without strategy, and instability threatened everyone's profits. The city did not want chaos. It wanted order. That order required removing the loudest variable in the equation. Schultz noticed changes in how information reached him. He began hearing news after it had already spread. Deals closed without his approval. Situations resolved without his involvement. His authority still existed on paper, but influence had begun slipping through unseen cracks. Influence always leaves before power does. Instead of adapting, Schultz doubled down on who he had always been. He raised his voice. He made examples. He reminded everyone of past violence, past bodies, past fear. He believed memory would save him. He did not understand that memory was now working against him. Every reminder of his past only strengthened the argument that his future was a problem. The insult, once a single moment, had become a defining flaw. Those who once shielded him stopped doing so, not openly. They simply stopped intervening. When rumors surfaced, no one corrected them. When threats appeared, no one reported them. When danger approached, no one warned him. The city was not plotting loudly. It was allowing inevitability to move forward unopposed. Schultz felt cornered without knowing where the walls were. He still believed he could strike first if needed. He still believed violence would reset the board. What he failed to grasp was that the board had already been replaced. There was no single enemy to confront, no obvious rival to destroy. The danger no longer wore a face. It wore patience. As days passed, Schultz's isolation became complete. He was surrounded by people, yet protected by no one. The insult that began as arrogance had transformed into abandonment. And abandonment in the underworld is a death sentence that arrives quietly. Schultz was still alive, still powerful, still feared. But he was no longer defended. And in New York, a man without defenders is already halfway gone. What Schultz did not know was that the city had finished deciding. The only thing left was timing. The final phase did not begin with an attack. It began with permission. By the time Schultz reached this point, no one needed to convince anyone else that he was a problem. That debate was over. What remained was timing. Timing mattered, because the city did not want chaos spilling into the streets. It wanted resolution without noise, a clean removal that would look inevitable in hindsight, not reckless in the moment. Schultz misread this pause as hesitation. He believed the city was afraid to move against him directly. He believed the silence meant uncertainty. That belief allowed him to relax just enough to make the worst mistake of all. He began to act as if the danger had passed, as if the insult, the tension, the distance had all burned out without consequence. That was exactly what others were waiting for. Schultz returned to familiar routines. He stayed longer in public places. He trusted the same faces. He moved without urgency, convinced that if something were going to happen, it would have already happened. Men who knew better did not correct him. They watched. They noted times, locations, patterns. Silence became cooperation. The city did not rush. It never rushed at this stage. Behind closed doors, paths were cleared. Obstacles were removed quietly. Loyalties were confirmed without being spoken aloud. The most dangerous thing about this moment was how calm it felt. Violence was no longer emotional. It was administrative. A task to be completed with minimal disruption. Schultz felt confident enough to provoke again. Not openly, not with the same recklessness as before, but enough to remind people that he was still Schultz, that he still ruled through fear. He believed reasserting dominance would pull the city back into line. What it actually did was finalize the decision against him, because it proved he had learned nothing. Men who might have hesitated now stopped hesitating. The insult that began everything was no longer a single incident. It was a pattern of misreading the room, a pattern of mistaking restraint for weakness, a pattern of choosing pride over survival. The city responded the only way it knew how. It gave Schultz space. Space to feel safe. Space to lower his guard. Space to walk into rooms believing he was still untouchable. No warnings were issued. No threats leaked. This was not personal. It was structural. Schultz was being phased out of the system he once dominated, and he never saw it happening. On the outside, nothing looked different. Business continued. Money moved. Faces smiled. Schultz interpreted normalcy as victory. He did not realize that normalcy was camouflage. The city wanted him comfortable. Comfortable men make predictable mistakes. Predictability was all that remained. Schultz had become predictable in his arrogance, predictable in his roots, predictable in his assumptions, predictable in believing fear would always protect him. Fear did protect him once. Now it protected everyone else from him. The insult that started everything had reached its final consequence. It had stripped Schultz of allies, then of defenders, and now of caution. The city had waited long enough for him to expose himself fully, and he had done it willingly. The final decision did not feel dramatic to those who made it. It felt necessary. Schultz was not being punished. He was being removed. As night approached, the city did not buzz with anticipation. It settled into routine. That routine hid movement, quiet confirmations, doors opening where they should not have, doors closing behind the scenes. Schultz moved through his world, unaware that the margins for error had vanished completely. He still believed he had time. He did not. Because once the city agrees, it does not argue with itself. It acts. And when it acts, it does so without warning, without mercy, and without reversal. Schultz walked into that night thinking he had survived the storm. He did not realize the storm had already passed. What remained was the aftermath, and Schultz was standing directly in its path. The end did not arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty. By the time the final moment came, Schultz was no longer fighting enemies. He was facing a conclusion that had already been written. The city had finished deciding what to do with him, and when New York decides, it does not hesitate. It moves forward, as if the outcome has always been obvious. Schultz never understood that his downfall was not about money, territory, or power. It was about control. And control had slipped from his hands the moment he chose humiliation over calculation. The insult that once felt small had rippled outward until it touched every corner of his world. It had changed how people saw him, how they spoke about him, how they planned around him. Most importantly, it changed how they felt about his survival. In the underworld, death is not always personal. Sometimes it is procedural. Schultz had crossed from feared leader to uncontrollable variable. Once that line is crossed, there is no apology strong enough, no violence loud enough, no money clean enough to reverse it. The final hours felt ordinary. That was the cruelty of it. Schultz moved through the city, believing routine meant safety, familiar walls, familiar faces, familiar rhythms. He did not see that familiarity had been weaponized. Predictability had become permission. The city had learned him, measured him, and positioned itself accordingly. When the end came, it did not announce itself. It arrived as consequence. Everything Schultz had relied on failed at once. Fear did not save him. Reputation did not shield him. Past violence did not intimidate the future. The city that once flinched at his name now absorbed his absence without shock. That silence, again, said everything. The insult echoed one last time, not as arrogance, but as evidence. Evidence that Schultz had mistaken dominance for immunity. That he believed power excused disrespect. That he forgot the most dangerous truth in New York. Men will tolerate brutality longer than humiliation. Violence can be managed. Insult cannot. After Schultz was gone, the city adjusted quickly. That adjustment was the final insult. Operations stabilized. Tensions eased. Money flowed more smoothly. The chaos Schultz brought with him vanished overnight, as if the city itself exhaled. No statues were built. No mourning followed. No one rushed to defend his legacy. History does not preserve men the city chooses to erase. What remained was a lesson no one needed explained. Power is not loud forever. Rage does not age well. And insults, once spoken, do not disappear. They wait. They grow. They recruit. They become decisions made far from the man who spoke them. Schultz's empire did not collapse in a war. It ended in agreement, an agreement that he would not be missed. The most shocking part was not how fast he fell, but how smoothly the city moved on. His name became a reference point, not a presence. A warning whispered to ambitious men who believed fear alone could carry them forever. One insult had done what years of violence could not. It revealed the moment power stopped working, and New York never gave it back. The city learned, once again, that the deadliest mistake a powerful man can make is believing he is the exception to the rules everyone else lives by. Schultz believed that lie until the very end. By the time he understood the truth, the city had already closed the book, and it never reopened it.